Back in the clearing, the Master Chief looked at the apparent leader of the group known as Kalen, and that was when Cortana spoke to him without revealing herself to the Night Elves. Normally I suggest not revealing critical information, let alone your identity, but we are short on information and you don't have to go into specifics, so go ahead and tell her just who you are, and I suggest what you also mention what you are. After that display I can wager a guess that they might think of you as some sort of demon, so let's not give them the wrong idea. The Spartan snorted a bit and replied to his I companion. Doesn't mean I have to like it. Cortana laughed gently at that and answered back. It's up to you, John, but not answering a woman's questions is naturally considered rude after all. Fine. As soon as that was out of the way, John directed his attention to the Night Elf and replied to her question in crisp military fashion, as he was trained to do ever since he was on Reach. Master Chief Petty Officer Spartan 117, member of the United Nations Space Command Navy. If anything, it served to confuse the Night Elves as they looked at him with more confusion than expected, and John wondered just what to do with this kind of situation. He was more used to fighting the Covenant and the Loyalists as well as the Flood and insurrectionists. This was way beyond his knowledge since he had been trained to fight and diplomacy was usually done by trained diplomats. But he decided to help along if they wanted to ask any more questions, and sure enough, they did, or at least Kaylin did, as she was the leader. What is this UNSC you speak of? What sort of name is that? John replied once more in full professionalism. I am Master Chief Petty Officer Spartan 117, but if you want a shorter name, just call me Master Chief, or just Chief, that will do just fine. As for the UNSC, it is the faction that I served for over 30 years of my life as a Spartan. Kaylin looked at the being, though she had to strain her neck in doing so. He was tall, there was no doubts about that, and looking at his faceplate with her face looking back at her had a slightly troubling effect on her. But she was a veteran warrior and she was not going to be easily intimidated by anything or anyone for that matter. She then decided to find out more about this stranger. One thing however was for certain, and that in the way he spoke. This told her that he was a soldier like she was. All right. Chief, what race are you? The Spartan replied to that with only one word. Human. That was enough to shock the Night Elves. They had met the humans already, though not in the most benevolent of terms, but this thing was human? They had no idea that the humans would have such a fearsome warrior in their ranks. Where was this warrior during the Third War? If he had been there, he would have been quite a deadly asset in fighting the Burning Legion. Were there others like him? Was this UNSC this giant spoke of part of the alliance from Lordaeron as well? If it was, why was it not with them when they came here? So many questions were in the minds of the others, but Kaylin had only two, and she was not going to let them remain in her head for too long. Can you prove that you are human? John had to give this Night Elf woman credit. She was not intimidated by him, and that was rare. Most human soldiers in the UNSC were usually in awe of the Spartan, while the Covenant, depending on the side, had other reactions. The Separatists had respect, and the Loyalists had hatred. This unknown Night Elf was showing none of those and seemed focused on trying to make sure that he was not a threat. He could read that much from her body movements and the way she looked at him. I am human, that's all that you need to know for the time being. Kaylin frowned at that. She was angry, of course, but she kept her temper in check and reminded herself that fighting this being was not exactly the wisest of ideas, considering how he easily slaughtered the orcs and the ogre. However, she did have one more questions and decided to ask it quickly and figure out the last piece of the puzzle. All right then, now my next question. Is this UNSC you serve located in the lands of Azeroth and part of the Alliance? The giant shook his head slightly and replied. No. Kaylin was even more confused by all this. Here was a supposed human who was telling her that he was not from Stormwind itself, the capital city of the humans. Even more than that, he was telling her that his faction was not part of the Alliance and was not on the continent of Azeroth. This confused her a great deal, and she was nowhere near any answers that made sense to her. For now, however, she decided to shelve those questions aside for the moment and focus on the more pressing matters. Where were you going? The Spartan then replied. To get back to my ship and set up a base of operations. Now if you'll excuse me, I need to get moving. The Spartan turned and began to head off in a different direction in order to get to the Hef, but before he could go anywhere, the woman was before him, and to his surprise, as well as that of Cortana, she had an arrow notched in her bow and aimed right at his visor. This woman had guts to be aiming an arrow that was nigh useless against his shields, let alone his Mjolnir, and he had to respect that in this woman. The other Night Elves were stunned by this, but they didn't stop their leader from her actions. That showed that they respected head for their leader, and the Spartan could understand that. He however replied quickly and patiently. Why are you aiming that at me? Kalen replied. I do not trust you, Chief. I am a sentinel and my duty has always been to the safety of my people and my home. You might have saved my life and the lives of those in my patrol, and for that I do thank you. But I cannot just let you wander around here without supervision. Doing so would be a violation of my oath to protect my people. I do not know for sure who or what you are or if you truly are human, and until I find out who you truly are and where you come from, you are not taking a single step further in the forests of Kalimdor. The Spartan couldn't help but feel a slight smile appear on his face. This woman is a soldier through and through. She is duty-bound to protect her people and world, willing to give her life to protect them, and I can respect that. Right? Parenthesis. The Spartan then replied. I assure you that I am no threat to you and your people. In fact, your people may be able to help me. Explain yourself. My ship came here and crashed safely, as one can get. While I do have its location, I do not have the lay of the land nor the information of its people. Your race are the first I encountered already, and I am not here to wage wars with anyone. If you like, you can accompany me to the site and you can be assured that I won't cause trouble, and I have a proposal. Kalen relaxed a bit and spoke once more. What do you have in mind? I prove to you that I am not a threat to you. I can also help you fight any possible threats you encounter along the way, and in turn, you help me know just where is it I happen to have landed in with information. Why? I am in an unknown land, surrounded by unknown beings, cultures, civilizations and more besides. I need information of cultures, customs, social hierarchies, factions, everything. I need to know who are the sides and what is going on here so I can make the right decisions that will be key to my survival here in this world, which no doubt is your home. Information is power and I need information, which is what you have. Kalen thought it over and weighed the options. The offer sounded sincere and she decided that she and her group would greatly benefit with the being's skills and weapons when it came to fighting other threats, especially when they fought with the orcs. She also thought about what he was asking from her. Information was a powerful thing, however she was very careful in this train of thought. Information was a very valuable commodity and she was aware of its power. After all, it was with information that they were able to survive the war with the Burning Legion and more besides. If she gave this stranger the information he wanted, what was he really going to do with it? She knew that she would have to decide quickly since there was no telling what could happen soon as long as they stayed here. She then replied after making her decision. All right, I accept your proposal, but make one thing clear. If you do anything that I consider a threat, I will not hesitate to fight you, even if I will die doing so. With that, the night elf left to check on the rest of her group to check on the wounded and injured, while the Spartan was left alone to speak to her Spartan companion, and the Spartan could hear the amusement in her voice. Not bad at all. We get them on our side for now and you get information on this world we happen to be in. You've gotten rather quick on the tongue there, big guy. I suppose, but it was the best option. I know, they already know that you are more than able to fight them and take them on in a fight despite their numerical superiority, and the fact that you will be willing to help them might put them in a more relaxed mood. Not only that, the extra hands will be helpful since we do have limited supplies until we get to the Hev, since there is no telling what other creatures we have to deal with until we get there. Plus they know the land, so we might get access to some shortcuts to cut travel time. Still, that woman certainly has guts, aiming an arrow at you like that. I like her spirit. John snorted a bit in good humor as he also had to respect the woman who only moments ago had aimed an arrow right at his helmet's faceplate. Not many did that to a Spartan, and he saw her eyes, glowing in awe. She was a veteran of many battles and no doubt this made her braver than most people. He then looked at the woman as she checked her comrades, both male and female, to see the extent of their injuries, and he saw the ones with the claw weapons casting some sort of spell that seemed to help mend the wounds of their allies. Cortana took a quick interest at what she was looking at and replied. Remarkable. Whatever those men are doing, it seems to help stimulate the natural regenerative properties of the body. I am picking up some weird energy readings coming from them, though I don't detect any massive energy readings that would signify an attack. The Spartan nodded as he saw that the wounds of the night elves were beginning to mend before his eyes. He moved closer to allow Cortana to have a closer look, and there he saw some of the wounds closing up right before him. That was when he realized that the number of wounded is a bit higher than the number of healers present, and an idea clicked to him. He then placed aside his weapon by placing down and removing the rucksack from his back and opening it to see what supplies he had with him for healing purposes. He had made sure to pack extra medical supplies for any kind of situation, even though his Mjolnir Mark VI had built-in biofoam injectors with a self-sustaining supply of biofoam. Spartans were trained for anything and everything, so he brought all he needed when it was possible. That was something that his mentor and trainer, Senior Chief Petty Officer Franklin Mendez, had trained into him and his fellow Spartans since they were young, and that lesson had saved them more than once. Most people who would see the harshness and ruthlessness of the man's training of such young children would call Mendez a sadist and a monster, but the Master Chief knew otherwise. Mendez's lessons had been invaluable in shaping him and his fellow Spartans into the soldiers they were today, and those skills, abilities, and the knowledge were key to not just their success but also their survival. They would not have lasted as long as they had without his training, and that training helped them turn what would have lose after lose into tactical victory during the wars with the Covenant. Mendez was the father figure to them, and that was why no matter what others thought of the man, he and his fellow Spartans were always thinking highly of him whenever they thought back on their past lives. He checked to find that he had more than enough supplies and moved over to the wounded night elves and opened one of the health packs to begin treatment, but was stopped by Kaylin, who looked at his materials with suspicion as she spoke. "What are you doing?" "Showing you that you can trust me for the time being. I will help tend to the wounded in your group." The night elf then replied. "Our druids can handle that part well enough." "True, but they will need to use their magic in combat as well, and the quicker your people are treated, the faster we can get moving." Kaylin looked a bit at the Spartan, and she didn't want to show it, but she understood the meaning of that statement. The magic of rejuvenation took time to work, and since they were a fairly large patrol, they had to wait for the magic to work to full effect, so travel was not possible, especially when wounds and injuries would prove fatal to them. She, however, wondered just what sort of healing could this Master Chief give to her people. After seeing how much carnage he could unleash, the idea of this being a healer was rather hard to swallow. However, she decided to try and see if what this being said was real. "Go ahead." The Master Chief got to work quickly, took out several canisters of biofoam as well as some self-sealing and adhering antiseptic bandages, polysomorphine, and a stitch kit. As soon as he got his materials together, he went to work patching up the wounded night elves. He gave them warnings that the biofoam would hurt a bit at first touch, and sure enough it did, making the women moan out in pain, but that sort of pain lasted for a second at best, and soon he placed the bandages on the wounds. For the more serious cuts, he stitches them up first to seal up the wounds carefully. Use the polysomorphine to dull it and use the biofoam and then the bandages. Spartans were no strangers to doing first aid after all. They had to treat their own injuries as well as that of their fellow Spartans as part of their training in order to survive in the battlefield. So despite their near-invincible and supposedly merciless war machines' reputations, they were able to heal and treat wounds to keep themselves in top fighting form. The healing work for the Spartan took only half an hour at best, since there were a number who needed treatment, and then Master Chief was happy with the work he had done. He got up and left. The Spartan was busy gathering his supplies as he looked at the recovering night elves he had treated. Seeing them back on their feet told him that his work was done, though he made sure to warn them that the medicine was temporary since the effects would wear off in a few hours. However, their wounds would be all right once they were further healed by their comrades. That statement was proven to be true, as the druids found that they needed to cast less of their magic on the wounded as their bodies were healing well enough. This allowed them to reserve more of their magic for more important times, and the other female night elves were impressed by how quickly their wounds had healed as the Spartan moved to recover his sniper rifle. Once he recovered it, he checked his ammunition stores and saw them to be all good, and he recovered his combat knife, cleaned it a bit and placed it back in the sheath, showing that he was ready to go on with his mission to locating the other falling objects. With nothing to lose and time on their hands, Kaylin decided to call it out, and her patrol went forward to follow their newfound guest and possible ally, though the senior night elf sentinel still had some of her doubts about the Spartan. Horizontal ellipsis. Several hours later, as the group reached the HEV, the Spartan tapped the code into the control console to make the HEV fire its hatch open. The Spartan then told the night elves to stand back and avoid being hit. However, having witnessed the whole thing happen before, the warning was not entirely needed, as they stayed a good way away from the HEV. The door exploded away, and the Spartan checked the contents of the HEV and found all the supplies and spare weapons that he had stored in the HEV. He then checked his chronometer and saw that it was already going to be 4 o'clock in the morning. It had been at least several hours since he had finally gotten on the move after treating the wounded and moving through the forest, since the new group actually slowed him down. It was a bit of a problem, but the fact that they knew the land helped somewhat as they moved through areas that helped shave off more time from his trip, and the extra support was helpful. There had been encounters with several unknown creatures, some of them were naturally hostile, and while he had been more than able to hold his own, he had been able to see the night elves in action, and he gave them credit. Their skills were very useful, and their weapons, while primitive by any standard of the UNSC, were highly effective. No doubt their long lives here in this kind of world made them excellent in survival and tracking, and the Spartan wondered just how they would perform in other environments. Cortana had joked to him that if any of the UNSC guys got to see the night elf females in action, they would have been more than happy to work alongside them. And despite his professionalism, he couldn't help but agree a bit, as he could see the appeal there for the men, despite the fact that the night elves were technically aliens. He decided that now was the right time to grab a much-needed meal. As much as he wanted to go all the way to the dawn and check the frigate status, he was not going to do much if he lacked the energy to do so. He might be a battle-hardened Spartan, but he was no god and he was no machine. He needed energy like the next UNSC Marine, ODST, Army, Navy, and Air Force personnel. With that in mind, he turned to face Kaylin, who was still there near him. "We can rest here for now, grab a meal, and when we're done, I will push on to the dawn." Kaylin nodded and looked to her comrades and spoke. "All right, we'll set camp here for now and get some food and rest. Let's get a campsite set up as quickly as possible." "Yes, Sister Captain." The women got to work gathering nearby firewood, while the men began to look about for hunting game, as well as looking for wild fruit and vegetables that would make part of their meal for the day. They also appeared to have carried some supplies for making fire. While some set up the camp, others armed with their bows stood guard to make sure that no one attacked them. The Spartan mentally nodded in appreciation for the professionalism of the Night Elf Patrol, and he made that evident to Kaylin. "Your groups shows a great deal of discipline." Kaylin nodded and replied, "We have to. Our numbers aren't like what they used to be ever since the battle at Mount Higel. We have to make sure that we do our best to survive and avoid losing too many of our people in pointless battles and field accidents. We lost so many." The Spartan could see that this battle was something of a sour topic for the Night Elf, and he could understand that. He had been in very serious battles himself, in the worst. "No need to think about that, not now. Right, parenthesis. I'll set up my camp here near the Hev." The Spartan left the Night Elf to look at his back. She sighed to herself and headed off to the camp to help out with the setting up of their camp. The Spartan was busy with thoughts in his mind, but as soon as he got to the Hev and soon got to work setting up his own camp, there was a small stream nearby, and he quickly rummaged through his supplies to see what he could use. He found a ferrocerium rod that would be used to make a fire and took that with him. He gathered some dried wood nearby and quickly got enough fuel for a fire and worked his magic with his recovered combat knife and soon got a fire going easily. The warm fire was not for warmth, as his Mjolnir Mark 6 was more than able to handle that requirement, but for morale and also for heating water for what he needed. He had several MREs with him, and he opened one and pulled the special heating tab that triggered the hidden heating weave that was in the tray that held the food there, warming it up and making the food good and hot for ideal eating. The MRE had hot mashed potatoes with butter already on it that melted to add more flavor to it. There was also boiled peas and carrots, as well as several slices of well-cooked beef with now hot gravy on them. The Spartan quickly took out the specially made spoon and fork, as well as the sachets of coffee powder, cream, and sugar. He then got out a small pot made from metal and poured in the coffee, sugar, and cream. When he took some cool water from the stream, Cortana analyzed the water and found it to be fit for drinking with no bacteria and parasites. He then made a quick tripod from several strong metal wires, and as soon as he was done, he hung the pot over the fire and got down to eating his meal, while occasionally making sure to stir the contents of the pot to make the mixture blend well together. He naturally removed his helmet and began to dig into his food, and he was feeling a good deal better. One thing that he learned early on in his career as a Spartan was to never underestimate the power of a hot meal. He might never show it on his face, but he felt very relieved whenever he was able to have a hot meal in his mouth and in his stomach. Horizontal ellipsis. As he ate his meal with military discipline and focus, he thought about his next set of options. So far he had been able to get on the side of the Night Elves, though he was curious about the ramifications of his siding with them over those orcs. Most people would have opted not to get involved with what happened before, and just let the Night Elves and the orcs fight one another to the death. That way they were free to go ahead. However, the Spartan knew next to nothing about the land. Gathering topographical data was one thing, as well as gathering data on the cities on the maps. That was easy to do with the kind of technology he had to work with and Cortana's help. What was the hard part was the information on the ground. Who were the key players? What were the factions and organizations here? How many other races and cultures were there on this world? All this information was worth its weight in sweat, tears, money, and blood. Mendez once taught him a lesson from the books written Sun Tzu. He who knew himself and knew his enemy need not fear the result of 100 battles. He knew himself but not the enemy will have a loss for every victory, and he who knew not himself or the enemy will face defeat in every turn. Apostrophe. That was true, since it was only when many lives were lost in the opening days in the UNSC Covenant War that the UNSC was able to know enough to face the enemy before them. The data from recorder chips recovered from dead, dying or alive UNSC Marines, ADSs, and Army personnel would provide valuable tactical and strategic data to give the UNSC a fighting chance against their new foes. Gathering tissue samples from the bodies of the dead was one thing, gathering intelligence data from live beings was another thing entirely. He needed the information, as he had told Kaelin, and he chose to help the Night Elf Sentinel and her patrol for several reasons. The first was that they had not attacked him the very second they had caught sight of him. This told him that they were only aggressive when they knew a threat they knew and treated unknowns differently, which was a good sign for the time being. Had they attacked him, he would have considered them and all others like them hostile and killed them quickly on sight. The second was the fact that they were able to speak the human language of English. That meant that they had prior contact with humans, and that could be very valuable to him, as they would no doubt know more about where he could find other humans in the land. The third was due to their skills as residents in this land that they called home. They knew the landmarks well and would be great aids in cutting travel time for him. Plus they would be able to explain to him the various life forms here on this continent, which would save him a tremendous amount of headaches had he gone and did this on his own. He didn't want to waste valuable resources and fruitless ventures in an unknown land at all, since it was counterproductive, so having assistance from the natives was helpful. And the last was that he had a feeling that he could trust them, not enough to warrant him turning his back to them of course, but enough to tell him that he might be in better hands with them for now until he got what he needed. The orcs would have been also useful, but the very second he saw them attack the night elves, and from the bloodthirsty and suicidal way they did it, the Spartan knew already that aligning with them was not a viable option. Their knowledge of human language meant that they also had prior contact with humans, but their actions told the Spartan that their relations with humans would no doubt be hostile, and if they knew he was human, he had no doubt they would try and kill him. The savage attacks they did to him also told him that they were fanatics. Even when he was slaughtering their group, they didn't break and retreat to recover, but kept on charging like rabid wolves after a meal. Fanatics were not to be trusted in many ways, and who knew what could happen if they captured him somehow. The orcs he fought with displayed also a bloodlust that made them similar to the brutes when they went into a berserk rage in battle, and he didn't need to be working with them for any reason. As he ate his food with those thoughts in mind, he then moved the pot off the fire and poured himself a good helping of coffee, and he took another cup and got some of the cool water. He began to sip his coffee, taking the time to savor the taste and warmth. It had been so long since he had a proper meal, ever since getting back to Earth and fighting all the way to the Ark, so he decided to take his time to enjoy it, though his senses were still on full alert. Horizontal ellipsis. On the other side of the lake, the night elves were currently cooking a deer that the druids were able to hunt down while eating some of the wild fruits and vegetables that were brought in by the others. The patrol also took out several skins of cool spring water that they had with them, and they were making sure to have a good meal before they moved onwards with their guest. The fire was made magical to cook the meat well, and soon the night elves were finally able to relax somewhat. Kaelin sat near the fire and was deep in thought about everything that had happened so far in this night. One of the sentinels then spoke to her commander. "Sister, are you all right?" Kaelin sighed and replied to that. "I don't know. I hope that I am not making a huge mistake by allowing that being to walk to where he is going." The others had to agree, but one of the druids then replied, "While that is true, it seems that his route is taking him away from many of the settlements as well. Wherever his ship might be, it is very far away from many of the villages our people reside in. I have a feeling that if he had any ill will towards us, he would have fought us as well as the orcs." One of the sentinels nodded at that, and she spoke. "I have never seen such movements before in my life. It was too fluid and precise. If he truly is human, then he is unlike any human we have come across. His armor could be enchanted. That might explain his speed and power." "I don't think so. Remember, there was nothing to tell us that the armor was indeed enchanted or magically forged, as there had been no energy coming from it or had runes, magical symbols on it, and metal we would recognize as enchanted. I sensed nothing of any sort of magic that in our records that has anything to do with enchanted metal or any inherently magical materials." But how could he be able to do that kind of damage to an ogre with just his fist and kick? I have never heard of any human being able to do that for as long as I have been able to read about humans. Maybe he is indeed a demon and only uses some sort of armor that somehow contains and hides his fell energy? Then why did he heal us with those devices he had with him if he is indeed a demon? Maybe to let us lower our guard somehow, to make us see him as less of an enemy and make him seem more trustworthy to us. Demons of the Burning Legion may be subtle, but not that subtle. We have killed so many of their most powerful leaders and officers in the Battle of Mount Higil that they have lost a lot of their skilled forces who are excellent at manipulation. Besides, we have no idea what sort of metal could hide fell energy just yet. And if there was such a material, then the Legion would have been using that for all their forces, though I have my doubts as many of them would merely prefer to show themselves in their arrogance to destroy us in the open. Kaylin listened to the discussions between her patrol group as she ate her own food to satisfy the stumbling in her own belly when she finally realized that she had not been able to have dinner, and since it was soon going to be morning, they were not having breakfast. One of the older druids thought that over carefully and spoke out afterwards. What we can all agree on is this: he is not what he seems, and we must keep our eyes on him and make sure that we have him under surveillance at all times. He might become a valuable ally, but he can also be a deadly enemy if things were different. We must be very careful of this being until he gets what he wants. Shouldn't we inform High Priestess Tyrande of this? She must know more about this thing that has happened in our lands, as she is our people's leader. We will, but we must know more of this being first before we make a more formal report to High Priestess Tyrande. The discussions carried on for a good amount of time until Kaylin decided to check on their guest. She got up and headed to where his camp was, and when she arrived there, she was only able to see him place on his helmet, yet his face remained completely hidden to her still. Was he really a human underneath that golden plate and helmet, or a demon hidden in an armored shell designed to hide his true form? Many questions flowed through her mind as she looked at the Spartan move up and take that weapon he had with him, as well as the supplies he had taken from the Hev, or whatever it was that he called it. Several weapons were there as well, so she had to wonder just how her guest was going to carry them. The Spartan turned, and once more the golden faceplate that was its face greeted her once more, and she felt a shiver of unease run through her. She had ignored it before, but ever since seeing this being in action, she couldn't help but feel that this was a full-fledged and battle-hardened warrior before her. Her trainer, the Ancient of War Tarstri, once told her that sometimes warriors could tell the power and strength of one another just by looking and being close to them. She had taken it to heart, and it was now that she was beginning to sense that her trainer was right. This being radiated something that tickled her warrior senses in her mind. Those feelings were the kind one felt when facing a warrior of greater skill, experience, and power, according to her mentor, and is to be treated with respect and not to be underestimated. He is powerful and dangerous. I've already seen him action well enough, but still, what kind of battles did he take part in? Something wrong? Kaylin quickly realized that she had been staring at the chief without any hesitation and quickly replied, keeping her face under full control. Nothing. I came here to check on you and see if you were doing anything suspicious. The Spartan shrugged as he got ready to move out, but decided to ask if her party was ready to move out with him. Kaylin protested at that and told him to be patient, as her patrol had not been able to eat completely and have some rest. That grated on the Spartan's nerves, but he kept himself from overreacting and kept in mind that he had to earn the trust of the natives if he was going to be able to make sense of this world that he had just landed in. This also gave him time to study the night elves a bit more. He could see that they were a very well-knit team, Kaylin giving good orders and gave respect to her group while maintaining discipline. He could see that her group were willing to continue with going to where they were going to go and keeping watch over him. All in all, this was a well-oiled group and no doubt had seen plenty of action together for a very long time, which was something that made him feel some more respect for them. However, he remained objective. Aligning blindly with one side was not why he was here with them. He needed information and they had it, so there was no need to fraternize just yet with the night elves. The mission came first as always, and everything else will follow afterwards. He then activated a private communications like with Cortana. Cortana? What's up? How far are we from the dawn in terms of days and travel time? At least half a week at best. Hopefully we can avoid any more of those roving beasts and who knows what else. This is turning out to be one heck of a field trip. The Spartan had to agree with that statement as he looked about with his weapon ready and all of his combat senses on high status mode for the time being. The Spartan recalled encountering the wildlife here, some he and the others could avoid and some that were just too persistent and dangerous to ignore. Horizontal ellipsis. As soon as the camp was broken up, the group moved through the lands with the Spartan moving alongside Kaelin as she decided to tell him what he needed to know about the land he was currently in. Apparently this continent they had chosen to land in was called Kalimdor and was home to the Night Elves for the most part, though they mostly took up residence in the northern sections of the continent to be near the forests and lands that were sacred to her people. They were not the only races who called Kalimdor home, however. To the middle of the continent known as Central Kalimdor, which according to Kaelin was a tough land that had verdant plains, desert lands, savanna, with large and small islands near the coastal areas as well as marshes and swamps, and was home to the New Horde. It naturally had mountains, hills and canyons befitting the land and was home to not just the Horde but the Centaurs as well, along with other races. And to the south were ancient ruins and more besides in the past when the Night Elves had greater power and influence before the Sundering. John tried to get more information about this for both himself and Cortana, but Kaelin was tight-lipped about that one and he decided to save that for another time. All he could glean about it was that South Kalimdor was a contested hot zone and was not for the faint of heart, for good reason, as there were very few towns there from either the Horde or the Alliance. He then asked about the Alliance first, and it was there that he learned about the time when the Night Elves first encountered the Alliance and the Horde and how things had changed for them ever since they had first fought both the Alliance and the Horde and eventually sided with them to fight the Burning Legion's forces when the second invasion occurred. Kaelin then told the Spartan that if he wanted to know more about the more in-depth events of history, then he would be best talking to the scholars, druids, and archivists. She concerned herself with more present matters, though she was willing to talk about what she knew from her own accounts on the ground, as it were. He did just that and wanted to know more about the Alliance as she knew it. He learned that Alliance had come from another continent called Lordaeron after the Burning Legion attacked it after they were summoned with the aid of an undead army known as the Scourge. This alliance of humans, dwarves, gnomes, and high elves, led by one Jaina Proudmoore, who was now ruler of a place known as Faramore Isle. Once they came there, they came under attack from their old foes, the Horde, or in this case, the Warsong clan of the Orcs. That told the Spartan already that the Orcs were a clan-based race, and that was a very difficult thing to deal with in his mind. Though they were one race, they were divided into clans and had different customs and the like, so communicating with them was going to be challenging. But he placed that aside and listened even more to Kaelin. She didn't know what happened, but the Horde and the Alliance decided to work as one in order to fight the Legion, and this was where her kind had conflict, as before the two sides worked together. The Orcs had desecrated their forests for lumber to build their homes, which led her people to go to war in anger, and in that same battle with the Orcs, they had taken demonic power and had slain someone of great power and importance to her people, a demigod named Cenarius, and that was why her people developed an intense hatred for the Orcs and hunted them whenever they could. And this carried on today even after the leader of the Horde, the Orc warchief named Thrall, had told them that ones who slew Cenarius were not Orcs but fell Orcs. This was enough to tell both John and Cortana just where the racial hatred between the Night Elves and the Orcs came from. However, they privately talked together and decided to wait for a bit longer as well as gather more information before making a judgment of the Orcs and the Horde as a whole. Kaelin finally told them about the Battle of Mount Higil, where they finally aligned with both the Alliance and the Horde to finally strike down the Burning Legion. How hundreds on the Triple Alliance had died to buy time for Malfurion to accomplish his goal, and the end of it. Leading the current situation in the lands of Kalimdor. Horizontal ellipsis. After the end of the conversation, John decided not to ask about the Horde for now, but one thing was for sure, he was going to have to take his time to figure out what to do in this kind of a situation. If anyone had told him all this before and he had not landed in this world, he would have the person labeled as a certified lunatic and needed to be treated in a psych ward for the rest of his or her natural life. But of course, that was no longer an issue after what he had seen. The group managed to make good time due to the knowledge of the Night Elves of the land, though they had pointed out that they were skirting rather close to the borders of Central Kalimdor and had to be careful of possible encounters with Orc patrols that were around. However, they had managed to avoid them and set up camp late in the afternoon and were able to eat and rest. Once they were done, they would press on until nightfall. On the third day, they finally arrived at their destination, and soon the Spartan gave a slight sigh at the sight of the Forward Unto Dawn. It looks like the Forward Unto Dawn was going to be his home away from home for now in this unknown world, and he would not have it any other way, as this was the only thing that reminded him of the UNSC. As he moved past the hills and headed to the frigate, he had forgotten that the ones who had been with him were looking at the frigate with absolute surprise written all over their faces. Horizontal ellipsis. The night elves gaped at the sight of the wreck of the Forward Unto Dawn. They had no idea that what they had seen before was actually this massive. It resembled some of the airships that they had seen before, which were used by the Alliance and on occasion the Horde. But this massive thing made all those ships look like toys in comparison. It was huge, and there was no doubt that they were going to be in for more surprises. They had heard rumors of the Draenei home ship the Exotter being very large, and while this ship, after they recovered from their surprise, was not as large as the ship itself, it was still huge in its own regard. This patrol had dedicated itself to working in the lands of their people, so they had never set foot in the capital city of the Draenei to be sure, but they had heard rumors of the city's beauty and design. This ship, on the other hand, was a completely different thing altogether. This was more than enough to convince Kaelin that this Master Chief was not kidding about his faction not being part of the Alliance of Lordaeron, since if it was, then she would have seen at least one such ship like this in her time in the Sentinels so long ago during the Third War. Kaelin managed to catch up with the Spartan, who was a fair distance from them, and though she couldn't see the being's face underneath the helmet, she had a feeling that he seemed more relaxed at the sight of that thing before them all. "Is this your ship?" the Spartan replied to that. "Yes. This section of the Forward Unto Dawn. This was a UNSC frigate. It took part in a number of very critical battles, one of which I was part of as well. I can't say any more than that for now, but I can tell you that the other section of it was lost in transit." Kaelin did not like the implications of that as she looked at the ship. She was no expert, but seeing the melted cut on the ship sent pure shivers down her spine. It looked as if some power or another had actually cut the ship with something massive and super hot as she looked at it a bit more, which was not much of a problem considering the sheer size of the vessel and the height, both of which continued to increase. She and the others got closer to it. What could possibly be powerful enough to do that to a vessel this size? Just how big and long is this Forward Unto Dawn when it was whole? The Spartan saw no harm in telling her the original dimensions of the Dawn, and Cortana likewise agreed with that assessment. With the Dawn stuck here and not going anywhere anytime soon, there was no reason not to tell the Night Elf leader what the ship once was in the past. Before it got cut in half in the battle, the ship was a good 1,607 feet at length, at width at least 509 feet, and at height, at least a good 457 feet. Kaelin couldn't help but be awed as she began to picture the size of this vessel when it was not dissected by whatever it was that reduced it to such a state. She shook her head and spoke. "So this is the most powerful warship in your forces?" The Spartan turned at that, and even though she couldn't see the chief's face or read the body language, she swore that somehow she felt that he was somewhat amused by her statement, though she couldn't tell. He then spoke to her after a moment of silence. "Actually no, the ships of the frigate class of the UNSC Navy is considered to be the weakest in terms of firepower and armor, and is the smallest of our ships. They make up for those weaknesses with being much easier to build and can be fielded in larger numbers." That statement stopped Kaelin and her patrol dead in their tracks as they looked at the ship in utter wonder. This ship by their standards was nearby the size of a well-fortified castle with a whole siding inside of it, had the length to take in a number of villages into itself, and the height that was nearly that of a mountain. And this being calls it the weakest ship his faction has? If that was true, then how big were their most powerful ships? They then looked at the side and saw the name of the vessel itself, and there they spotted an emblem, a bird of prey, like a large eagle with his wings fully revealed in its glory, gripping in its talons what appeared to be a globe of a world and a single white long banner there on the lower area of the globe with the letters UNSC. This further told Kaelin that maybe this Master Chief was not kidding about him not being part of the Alliance. They finally recovered enough of their wits and followed the Spartan as he reached an access doorway and began to type in something on some sort of glowing pad, and soon what appeared to be nothing but pure metal walls parted to reveal that it was a door. The Night Elves were very much worried about going in there. The idea of entering this fortress of metal did not sit well with them, especially the druids, as it felt utterly unnatural to them. However, they decided to take the risk to learn more of this strange being and followed him. Horizontal ellipsis. As they moved into a massive hallway, the Spartan checked the entire floor with his MA5 CICWS assault rifle on and his enhanced eyesight already helping him scan the ship. For now it seemed that no one was in the ship, and the emergency lighting was still very much operational and gave some low-level lighting in the area. He then spotted what he was looking for and spoke to Cortana. "All right Cortana, you ready?" "Yes, yank me, it's time I get to access the ship and see if everything we left behind is still very much in here. By the way, are you sure about this? We don't have much choice Cortana, we need their help after all." I know, but I'll tell you this much, John, this should be a very interesting day. The night elves watched in curiosity as Spartan walked over to some sort of tank shaped like a pillar with a small glowing circle in the middle. They stopped when he reached it, and then the Spartan reached behind his helmet and took out some small device that looked like a card of some sort that glowed. He placed it into a slot and stepped back. Suddenly the night elves were surprised to see what appeared to be a small human made from light appear, and it was female as it spoke in common. That feels kind of nice. The night elves were looking at the small human female made of pure light that glowed blue. Curiosity overcame shock and fear as they came closer to see if what they were seeing is real. As they looked at it, they saw symbols of some sort moving on the body of the woman of light. They naturally didn't recognize it. They quickly stopped when the blue woman of light turned to look at them and smiled. Greetings, my name is Cortana. Kaylin managed to get her head together and spoke back in common. I know who you are. You are Kaylin, Nightwalker of the Sentinels. I watched you and your fellow night elves with my Spartan when you were trying to track us a few days ago. You were there? Yes, you could say I reside in the head of my Spartan, as it were. What he sees, I see. What he hears, I hear. We are one, in a manner of speaking anyway. By the way, Cortana's body glowed a bit more, showing that she was somewhat annoyed by something. The frown on her face was also telling as she glared a bit at the night elf. I was also there when you pointed an arrow at my Spartan's face. Your weapon might not have done you much good, but even though I admire your courage, do not think I was entirely amused by what you did. John didn't like that. He knew Cortana was not happy, but he trusted her well enough so he didn't interfere as she glared at Kaylin, who managed to keep her expression calm and focused. Cortana then smiled a bit and seemed to relax as she spoke once more. At any rate, however, what's past is past. The here and now is important. John then spoke to Cortana, and despite hiding his face behind the helmet of his Mjolnir, he had to admit that it felt good to see her face to face again. How's the ship, Cortana? Cortana looked around the ship, and Kaylin had a sinking feeling that this being of light saw the ship differently than she and the others did. It was like she was peeling away the layers of metal around them and seeing all over it in a second. What was this being before them? Cortana then spoke to the chief in a great deal of familiarity. She's intact and not too worse for wear. Everything we locked down is all here. John nodded slightly at that, pleased with the results. Before they had gone down to the planet's surface after deploying the satellite, they had managed to get a full stock check of the Dawn's supplies. Before they moved out with the Separatist fleet, Keyes had ordered the Dawn loaded with some serious materials and equipment. Better to be safe than sorry, as one would say. The equipment included a working infantry weapons armor ammunition assembly package. This was a large collection of robotic units that were designed to manufacture all known weapons used by the UNSC as well as make ammunition for them. Designed to replicate the production capabilities of large-scale manufacturing plants, this was smaller and as such took longer to make weapons, armor and ammunition. However, it was more portable and as such would be useful in making new weapons and more with what materials he and Cortana had to work with. Another bit of equipment was a number of portable holotanks for more in-depth field operations and battle, which would be very useful to him and Cortana once they got whatever information they needed, as well as several crates full of data crystal chips for increased amounts of storage space for information. These would be valuable to them since they would also serve as sources of data for Cortana to use in order to help keep her in good functional status. There were also crates filled with working UNSC bubble shields. These would be limited but were very useful when the time came. There were TR-9 anti-personnel mines in the supplies, as well as a number of salvaged Covenant Loyalist equipment such as regenerators, power drains, flares, cloaking, deployable cover, portable gravity lifts, radar jammers, and thankfully enough some incivility units. The gear might seem out of place in such a world that was not dominated by technology, but in the minds of Cortana and John, there was nothing stopping them from making modifications. Along with those things, were working components for a hydrogen reactor bank. This would prove very useful as this would shift away some of the strain of powering the Dawn from the 4 deuterium nuclear fusion reactors that served to power the Dawn. The trip through the portal and the results of the collapse had damaged them and it would take time to be fully repaired, so they needed to make sure that they didn't put too heavy a strain on the reactors until they were once more at full efficiency. There were also a number of extra robot rovers. These machines were loaded into the Dawn for more serious duties as they had no idea what they were going to face once they crossed into the arc beyond the galactic rim. There were 7 of each type. The first were standard rovers used to carry tons of equipment and supplies. In essence, they were cargo carriers. The second were robotic dollies, specialized units for medical facilities to move supplies and patients in and out of certain areas when medical personnel were too busy to deal with multiple patients. And the last were the service drones. They were the ones for heavy maintenance and work. With him and Cortana being the only personnel here, having these units intact was tantamount to a gift from God if there ever was one. Added to that was a large number of UNSC weapons that were dragged into storage for that mission, even several M99 stanchion Gauss rifles which were phased out of service way back in 2521 were brought in for use in battle. Apart from this, there were also a number of stored Covenant weapons such as carbines, beam rifles, plasma rifles, needlers, plasma pistols, beam rifles and a good amount of plasma grenades and the energy swords. These were invaluable weapons of war and would be useful, though the Spartan knew better than to use them up since he had no way to reload them, and supplies for the carbines and needlers were going to very precious. The only thing that was interesting was that a number of brute weapons were on board as well, namely a number of spiker rifles and their trademark spike grenades. These had been taken from several battlefields on Earth before, and Miranda had requested that these were taken in and used instead of being left to rot. Besides, nothing would infuriate the brutes more than being shot at and blown apart by their own weapons. All of this was further supplemented by the fact that Lord Hood had requested at least 2 crates full of special replacement parts, spare fusion cells, BIOS data cards, testing equipment, and more for the Mjolnir Mark 6 straight out from Seongnam, Korea. Even though he thought that going to the Ark was madness, the head of the UNSC burned everything he had on this last gambit and gave everything he had to get those parts and more for him in the final battle, but he never got to use them in the Ark. John, however, decided to send a silent thanks to Lord Hood for his efforts. John was happy that they had lost none of these things, as they would be critical in his duties here, and now he had to worry about what to tell his potential allies. He spoke first to Cortana in order to get things off the ground. All right then, I think it's time we do what we talked about earlier, Cortana. We need to tell them. Kaylin and her fellow night elves were confused by this, and John replied as he was well aware of their confusion. He looked at Cortana and she smiled at him with a simple reply. I got enough power for that. The Spartan nodded and spoke to the assembled night elves as the main lights in the frigate finally came online, showing the night elves just where they were, and that was in a hangar bay where a number of still working UNSC vehicles were there. These had not been used in the battle since all the UNSC forces had been evacuated when they finally made the last strike at the Ark. That was why there was such a massive surplus of equipment still in the Dawn when it went through the portal. He also found out that Lord Hood had gone out on limb twice over when it turned out that he had taken a large number of vehicles to aid in the assault. All of this would soon be used at some point in time, that much the Spartan knew. There were a pair of Albatross heavy dropships, a half-dozen Pelicans, 4 Hornets, and 4 Hawks for air power. In the light vehicle category was a pair of Mach 9 Wolverines, a dozen and a half Mongoose ADVs, 10 Gauss Warthogs, 10 Lav Warthogs, and 12 Transport Warthogs. In the heavy armor category were at least a half-dozen fully upgraded M808B Scorpion MBTs, and to John's own inner surprise, a pair of Grizzly battle tanks and a single -145D Rhino. How Commander Keyes got her hands on even one of these experimental tanks was beyond the Master Chief, but he didn't mind in the least. The Night Elves were completely slack-jawed at this. They had seen the Alliance use steam tanks in the Third War before, but these things made those Alliance weapons look like mere toys. The UNSCA. I was amused by this and spoke to them. You wanted to know if the UNSC was somewhere here on your world, yes? The answer to that question is simple: we're not from anywhere on your world. You see, we came from another world entirely. What you see here is but a small part of what the UNSC uses, so there is nothing here that will telling if we are part of your world since we are not from around here. Horizontal ellipsis. The Night Elves were trying to digest all this as they looked at what was there before them, and as soon as they were done, Kaylin knew that this was something that truly demanded the attention of their people right off the bat. However, the Spartan told them once more that he and his companion were not here to invade or any of the sort. The two of them landed here to establish a place to stay and wait for rescue. They had no intention of fighting for anyone here on the ship or in the world in general. They just needed information so they had something to work with in order to make the right decisions. That was when the Spartan explained his reasons as to why he aided them when they were attacked by the orcs and why he had made that offer to Kaylin. The night elf then replied that they had to report this to their leader at Darnassus. The Spartan asked who their leader was, and that was when Kaelin talked to him about Tyr and Whisperwind. As he and Cortana listened to Kaelin talk about the woman who was the high priestess of the Sisters of Elune, they could tell that this person would be worth talking to. The fact that she was the official leader of the Night Elves further added weight to that idea. Hearing about her history, which included her training under this goddess Elune and with this demigod Cenarius, her skills in warfare despite being in a religious office all the way to the Third War, further reinforced the facts to both John and Cortana that she would be the first person she needed to talk to in order to get a much better understanding of the situation in the continent that they landed in. When they asked if they could meet and speak with Tyrande, this naturally didn't sit well with the Night Elves, as they had already seen what he was capable of, and the idea of letting him get inside their capital city and before their race's beloved leader was not pleasing. That was obvious, as despite what she had seen already, Kaelin got into the face of the Spartan and spoke seriously. "I will not let you do that. To let you in my people's home like that is near treasonous." John smirked at that as he began to respect this night elf a bit more, but he replied, "I will not bring any of my weapons if that will be enough for you. You don't need your weapons to do damage, I have no doubts of that." This trading of words between Spartan and Sentinel went on for some time until Kaelin decided to order one of her fellow druids to go and speak to Tyrande and Darnassus and see if the High Priestess was willing to even consider a meeting with the Spartan. The druid, one Jared Moonleaf by name, agreed and soon turned into a raven to take flight back to Darnassus. In the meantime, seeing that they were still needed on patrol, the senior sentinel gave orders for her group to go back out while she remained here to keep an eye on the Spartan. Naturally, her group protested, but she reminded them that they still had their duties as sentinels and it must be done, so reluctantly the other agreed, and that soon left the Spartan alone with the sentinel. As soon as that was done, the Spartan decided to at least give the night elf some good accommodations here in the ship and guided her to the nearby crew's quarters, and the night elf was surprised to see the row of bunks there. While the Dawn had a serotube area, it was not needed, and they still didn't know how Keelan's body would react in cryostasis. Besides that, the cryotubes were only used in trips through slip space. When they were in normal space, the beds were the ones to use. The sentinel looked about carefully and went to one of the beds there to see if it was good, and to her surprise, the beds were clean and the pillows were actually rather nice. She placed her bow down and sat there, surprised that the bed, despite its hard appearance, was soft and comfortable. She had never felt this before, and it showed on her face. That was obvious to the Spartan as he spoke to her while being at the door. "Is this enough? What? Is this room to your liking?" The night elf slowly nodded at that, and the Spartan replied, "Good." As the Spartan left, the door closed and Kaelin decided to rest. She might not show it, but even though she had gotten some sleep before, she had been hoping for a warm bed to rest in once she had gotten back to any of the villages for some time off after patrolling. But this bed was very nice indeed. She then propped her bow down and closed her eyes as sleep finally hit her. Horizontal ellipsis. Hours later, Kaelin had no idea how long she rested on the bed in this room, but she had been having a good dream of happier times until the invasion of the Alliance and the Horde into her home. She recalled the vivid battles that happened then, how she had been there when the orcs had slain Cenarius, and how she and her sisters were forced to leave after the demigod had been slain. The dream then changed to when her people had fought the orcs in a skirmish before. The dream became very vivid. She recalled fighting a pair of orcs. She had downed one, but she ran out of arrows as the other charged at her, axe ready to cut her down. She reached down to her sword and her warrior senses kicked in as she moved and took out the short curved sword she had on with her and readied to attack, only to have her arm held in a tight but non-threatening grip. That suddenly made her see white in a quick flash. The sentinel was shocked and opened her eyes to find her arm in the grip of the Spartan, who to her surprise was still in full armor and helmet. She found herself standing off the bed she had been sleeping in before and poised to fight. Just like in that dream. "You all right? What happened?" That was then Cortana's voice came over the speakers. "I picked up sudden changes in your body temperature and your movements, that told me you were in a dream, or rather a nightmare, so I sent Big Guy here to check on you. It seems you're awake." Kaelin realized that and quickly blushed at her actions and spoke. I apologize." The Spartan gave a slight shrug and released her arm from his grip and spoke. "It's nothing. By the way, it's already nighttime and time to have dinner. By the way, that druid of yours came back." "He did?" "Yes, while you were sleeping, he said that your high priestess is willing to meet with me. We're heading for Darnassus first thing in the morning."